So this is the basis of my current main project, and it's going to be a book on this topic, so I'm eager for feedback of all sorts. To sort of set the frame here, I want you to think about the big picture and whether you want to disown your descendants. Parents sometimes disown their children because they find them so repulsive in some way. And there's a sense in which your distant ancestors might not have been thrilled with a lot of features you have. Maybe for the most part they would have overcome that and embraced you, but maybe there'd be some hesitation with some of the ways in which, say, you become promiscuous or irreligious or whatever it is that they would have been somewhat repelled by. So I have this detailed image of what our descendants are likely to be like, and often people are repelled by this image. And in some sense, that's okay if you understand them, but I worry that people are repelled by some quick description and don't have a full picture of what this world is like. So my aim is to give as full a picture as I can, of course acknowledging my uncertainties and degree of speculation, so that people can have a best judgment about what their descendants are likely to be like and whether they like them, and whether you want to sort of embrace and help them or destroy them and prevent them all from existing somehow. It's at that level of, do you embrace or not? Or how do you relate to your descendants? So my key goal is to sort of give you a clear picture of what they're like. To introduce that, though, I need to step back. This is recent US GDP history. Of course, we had a big downturn you may have heard a couple years ago. This is what the sort of thing you hear about in the news. Each one of these bars makes a big deal when it shows up in the news. But if you step back from this, you'll find that over the last half century or so, world product, the total world economy across the entire world, across time, hasn't been exactly steady, but it's a lot steadier than you saw those few years. From a big picture point of view, the world's growing relatively steady, or maybe a little less steady recently than before, but relatively steady. If you go back even farther over the last 2,000 years, you see, although it was relatively steady growth over the last century or so, that steadiness didn't go all the way back. There was a period where there was growth much slower. Sometimes people say, well, it didn't grow and then it started growing. But that's not really fair either. Because if you go back farther, you see that from 5,000 BC up until a few hundred years ago, there was relatively steady growth. It was just a lot slower. In fact, the economy was doubling roughly every 1,000 years here, and here's doubling roughly every 15. So there's two straight lines, but they have a different slope. And then you go back to here and you can say, well, that looks like it didn't grow and then it started to grow, but of course on a bigger time scale, it was growing too, just slower, doubling every 250,000 years. So the big picture of history, you could say, is that there's these sequence of exponential modes. Now this is a log graph, log time before now, log world product, and then we have curves, but they fit relatively nicely, and you can even add in growth of brains before that, and then we can get a big grand story, which is over time there have been these relatively steady growth modes, and then sharp transitions to new growth modes. Brains growing slowly, humans growing, farming growing, industry growing, and in this framing of history, there's the obvious question, could this happen again? Could there be another spurt to a faster growth mode? And if so, what would cause that, and when would it happen, and how fast would it be? So if we take history statistics from these last modes, we'd say these are the doubling times in each of these modes. And then we can have a doubling time factor by how much did the doubling time increase. And over the last three things, there's a relatively consistent doubling time increase of a factor of 150, 250. And the amount by which things grew in the range of 200, 600. And if we use that to project forward, say when will the next thing happen, we get dates, depending on how we do it, in the range of dates that have already passed up to 2120. So you say within the next century isn't a very precise prediction, but hey, that's what you get within the next century. But if you ask the new doubling time, you get a remarkably precise prediction, 1 to 2 weeks. So that's what you're looking at. Sometime in the next century, a transition to something that happens where the new economy doubles every 1 to 2 weeks. And you want to know how fast could that transition happen. If the transition happened as gradually as the Industrial Revolution happened in sort of a power law terms, you look down here and you see in a scenario the world economy is growing 6.1% in 2039, again in 2040. And of course, there's fluctuations around this of say 4 to 8%. Then in 2041, there's a 0.5% boost. You wouldn't notice that in the usual fluctuations. Then it's up to 8%. You know, it's at the it's at the tail end of the usual range. And then 14, 40, 147, 500,000. Within a small number of years, it just goes completely to growing, doubling every month or week. So back in the early dot-com years, I had written this stuff up, and people said, "Is this it, Robin? Are we seeing this now?" And I said, "No, not remotely, not even close. No." And it wasn't. I was right. So, very basic question: what could cause something like this? So, if this is what's likely to happen, a very basic key question is, what would be the basic underlying source of something like this? And then we look at the various kinds of things people talk about that might be the basis of a big change. Science fiction and futurism, etc. Space, new energy sources, nanotech, robots. If we look at these things, we note that, say, if we break down, as an economist, we break down the economy in different sectors, we see that various kinds of power really only take a few percentage of the economy. Construction, raw materials, only a tiny percentage of the economy. We get new sources of raw materials, new sources of energy. It's really hard to see it making a big change in the economy because it's really only a tiny fraction of the economy. Even manufacturing, 15% of the economy. Nanotech, say, makes capital for manufacturing cheaper, 5% of the economy, but maybe there's pile-on effects, etc. But it's still kind of hard to see how these could make the economy go within 3 years from doubling every 15 years to doubling every 2 weeks. It's a pretty high standard for a change, right? So when we're looking for something that big, we're looking for something really big. But something that is plausibly that big, if we break down the economy by where the money goes in terms of labor, human capital, i.e. the training to be able to do labor, and other sorts of capital like natural resources, stock, things like real estate, this is a huge fraction of the world economy. If you could make this a lot cheaper, you could make the world economy drastically change. And I'm not showing you math slides where you can, in fact, can find the world economy doubling every week or so as a result of just making this more efficient. That actually follows from straightforward standard economic theory. So I'm drawn to thinking about robots as the source of the big transition. Some form of artificial intelligence, some way in which becomes easy. You are able to replace a lot of human labor, substitute for it with machines in some way. And since most of what human labor is valued for is the fact that these people are intelligent, are able to intelligently choose and be trained to do things, the question is, what will produce that? Now, the particular scenario I find most plausible for the origin of artificial intelligence is in some sense a conservative scenario. It's called whole brain emulation. There's a roadmap about it written by people here in the room. And the idea is that people might find some grand artificial intelligence theory whereby they figure out how to write software that can be intelligent, etc. But people have been looking at that for a while. They haven't found it. There's no particular prospect of finding it soon. They may never find it for 500 years. But this will work eventually, and we can sort of set timescales over when it should plausibly work, and a century or so does seem like a plausible timescale for this to work. So what we need for whole brain emulation, we have to sort of go in and understand brain cells enough to be able to model each cell in terms of input signals and output signals, and to know how that mapping works so that we can make a model of individual brain cells of all the different types that there are, which may be 30 or 300,000, we're not quite sure which. Then we have to take an actual particular brain and we scan it. That is, in particular, a straightforward way is you make it, you fix it or freeze it, and you slowly slice a layer, run a 2D scan across it at a very high resolution, slice another layer, run across. And the last technology we need is lots of very fast parallel computers, and then you basically just make a model of this particular brain whereby you make a model of each cell. And if you've got good enough models of the cell and you scan the brain with enough detail, then your model, when you turn on this model of the brain, it will have the same input-output behavior as the original brain, which makes it a very economically valuable item, because these are the economically valuable things on the planet at the moment. So now it matters which of these technologies is the one that's ready last, because it could be computing's ready last, or it could be the modeling's ready last. If the modeling's ready last, that's bad, because it's hard to predict when it will happen. Presumably it might all of a sudden happen to a group that nobody anticipated at a time they didn't anticipate, and that could be very disruptive. And that would mean if this was ready last, there'd be overhang in the sense you'd already have plenty of resources here, and suddenly a lot would happen. On the other hand, if you know how to do the modeling and the scanning, and the last thing you have is computers, then everybody will know it's just about to come. You're waiting for it to get cheaper. As the computers get cheaper, everybody tools up, gets ready, starts to, in parallel, transition and goes together. People see it happening ahead of time. They adapt, and it's decentralized and anticipated and relatively smooth. Scanning is probably the least likely thing to be ready last, because people are actually quite a ways advanced on this at the moment. And but if that were the last thing, then basically some coalition would have to put together a big pile of money and say, all right, we're going to be the one that does the first scan. And then when they finally did it, they could sell their scans for lots of money. They could sell their products. So I'm going to, in this talk, try to outline what this world of whole brain emulations look like. So let me, for a few moments, comment on my method, because everybody thinks that's important. The world is this vast fog of possibilities. There's all these different things that can happen at all sorts of different times. How do you sort it out? How do you figure out what to look at in that fog? So my focus is to look at a very particular, very sharp transition where that particular thing we can see a lot about, even if we don't know a lot of other things. So that would be this whole brain emulation transition, something that would happen at a point in time, and it would have, as I'm about to describe, enormous numbers of implications. And that helps me to sort of cut through the fog. And the other thing I'm doing basically about method is, although this sounds like a pretty radical talk, I bet, I'm trying to be very conservative in the sense that I'm just going to take standard methods and beliefs from two different academic fields that are rarely combined. Brain research and economics. So I'm going to just take very seriously what brain researchers say about what will be feasible within the next century. And I'm going to take very standard economics about how the social world works and what happens and what causes what. And I'm going to combine those two, and I'm trying not to be original. Trying not to be creative. Just apply this to that. That's my intention. Later on, if it becomes a larger field, other people can get creative and have new original alternative approaches. But in my opinion, there's way too much of trying to be creative about too many fields all at once. Let's just take the standard results from one field and apply it to the standard results to another field. So my method is going to be not to try to predict the entire future forever. I want to predict the first era of emulations and not everything that will happen after that. So in particular, the idea is that when you first know how to make an emulation, you know how to turn this model on and run it, and it has the same I/O behavior as a human, and you can sell it and do stuff with it. But in terms of taking it apart and rearranging stuff and making new things by combining this with that, you have no idea. And there'll be a long time, at least important time, where you won't know how to do that. And so I'm talking about that era. You know how to copy them, you know how to turn them on, maybe run them fast or slow, but you don't know that much. Maybe there's 20 parameters you can play with, and you can make them like giddy or sad or some few things like that, but beyond that you can't do that much. And I'm going to be looking for sort of typical behavior. It's going to be a big world. It's going to be complicated. Lots of stuff will be going on. Almost anything you can imagine might happen somewhere. But I'm focused on sort of the center of activity, what the middle of the distribution looks like. And later on, we can look for how weird the tails get. Also, I'm going to be taking a standard economist method, because again, I'm just going to apply standard method. As economists, we tend to focus on low regulation scenarios first and high competition scenarios. Our standard best method of supply and demand works best there. So looking for our keys under the lamppost, we apply our best method where we can apply it best, which is low regulation competition. And it turns out in the world so far that hasn't actually been a terrible approximation. It is a reasonable, good first place to start. So I'm going to be looking there. It doesn't mean I'm saying there should be no regulation. It doesn't mean I'm saying we should encourage vicious competition. Maybe we should. Maybe we shouldn't. But this is a method point. This is how economists analyze stuff. We start from that point, and then we start to analyze various kinds of regulation by comparison to the low regulation scenario. And another standard thing economists do is once we figured out this reference scenario, then in that reference scenario we start to do sign analysis. We say, well, if this parameter were to be changed up or down, would welfare go up or down? I.e., would things be better or worse? I.e., is there a market failure? So we try to identify market failures, ways in which parameters, we better to nudge things in one way. And that becomes our policy advice. We'd like to nudge, which way do you want to nudge things? We don't assume you can change that much. So you might as well think in terms of small changes and which way you want to move things. So that's how economists. So, and then finally, I'm going to be trying this immersive detail approach where I'm just going to try to imagine as many aspects of the world as I can and use each one to try to check the other so that they all fit together as best as I can. Obviously, a lot of things could go wrong, but you're still going to have the best chance of being accurate on each piece the more other pieces you try to think about and check and have integrated together. So that's my method. So now I'm going to start to tell you various results, i.e. things I think I can say about this world. And I'm going to tell you them at the beginning in terms of kinds of bases for these conclusions. So some conclusions come merely from the fact that the future will be big. It'll be a bigger economy than ours. It'll keep growing. And merely from that, we can expect that we will continue to develop more technologies, including social technologies of different kinds of institutions, and we'll have, therefore, more different kinds of ways to do things, including social ways to do things. So we'll have bigger organizations, more kinds of contracts, more coordination, things like that. Because the world is bigger, there'll be more division of labor, there'll be more niche products, more niche workers, more niche professions. Because the world is bigger, we can support a larger market for art and music and stories, etc. So there'll be more fragmentations feasible for that. There'll be more people competing to be the very best country singer, or there'll be more weird kinds of niche music that never existed enough customers to support before. But basically it would be a much larger world supporting more different kinds of art and products. There'll be more inequality, and I have a slide going into that into detail, but basically, just in general, larger worlds produce more inequality. Being the very best versus the worst, there's a bigger difference when the world's bigger. And that makes a difference. And then there are other sort of generic things about if the world's growing faster, that just generically means you'll want to transport things less and make them locally more, just because it's expensive. The time cost gets more expensive when things are happening faster. And there'll just be more of a premium on fast, flexible ways to do things because taking a year to figure out how to do something when the economy is doubling every 2 weeks is just way too long. You just have to find a fast, good enough solution quickly and then do something. All right. Now, in addition, there are implications that follow from a world of robots. A world of any sort of robots, not just whole brain emulations, any sort of robots. One set of a bunch of implications follow. Well, first of all, robots can in principle be immortal. Cars can be immortal now, houses can be immortal. Maintenance costs may go up with time. But if you pay the maintenance costs, they can be immortal. Robots can therefore be immortal if you can afford that. It's not obvious, of course, that people can afford to or be inclined to make them immortal, but immortality becomes mechanically possible. Travel becomes interestingly different when you have a digital encoding of a mind. It can travel just by being sent over communication lines. It doesn't have to have the physical body travel. And that makes travel a lot easier and faster in many ways. A world of robots doesn't need ecosystems so much. One of the reasons we protect the environment and try to prevent eco-collapse is that it kills us if it dies. And we don't want that to happen. A world of robots doesn't care so much about that, because if nature dies, it doesn't die. So maybe those humans it cares about do die or don't, but the robots themselves don't care so much about it directly. In a world where there's cheaper robot labor, work gets more labor intensive, thus capital intensive, fewer tools. The biggest thing that you get a lot of implications from just having a world of robot intelligences, machine intelligence, is that you can make copies easy. So you can just take all the memory that defines a robot in one spot, make a copy of it, put it in another robot, and now you get two robots that start out with exactly the same mental state. And from then, of course, diverge. But from that means you can make training, labor economics training, more like software design today. You put a lot of effort into making one thing well, and then you make a lot of copies of it. You don't have to train lots of people to be a great chemist. You just train one chemist and make lots of copies of the chemist. You very quickly get basically a Malthusian population explosion. The number of these things, robots, quickly becomes as large as anybody wants them to be, down to the point where the marginal cost of making them is the marginal value of the next one you could make. You get, therefore, a very rapid growth rate in the economy, as I was telling you before. And the wages of anything that competes with these robots has to fall to the cost of renting one of these robots, the hardware, and the cost of training one copy and then making many versions. And so those wages fall dramatically and rapidly to very low levels, well below human subsistence levels even. And that fact happens in a wide variety of scenarios. The details of property rights don't that much matter for that thing happening. Now, emulations are a particular kind of robot. So if the future is whole brain emulation robots, then we can say a lot more interesting things about that future, because emulations are emulations of humans, which means they remember being a human, they feel like a human, they have human personalities, inclinations, styles of work, styles of arguing, styles of everything. They are psychologically human. They are in an alienated world in the sense that their world is more different from their ancestors' world even than ours was, but that was also true, of course, for us or for farmers. We've had a long history of progressively moving away from our forager ancestor environment to a more alien environment. Because they are, computer creatures, if they're going to be doing office work, which of course a large part of our economy is, and a large part of the economy will continue to be office work, they might as well have a nice virtual reality office. No point in pushing real pencils around. So their office environment would be, exquisitely luxurious and rich, because why not? That's cheap in virtual reality. As would even the grimiest, miner who in their physical work is down in the mines knocking things. In virtual reality, when they kick off, they're back into virtual reality and luxurious palaces, etc. Because that's cheap for virtual mines, for computer mines. And presumably physical work is still a minority of the economy, as it is in our economy. These creatures can be more unequal from each other than we are, merely by the fact that you can put them in different bodies, large bodies, small bodies, fast bodies, hot bodies, etc. And then you can run these brains at different speeds. And we'll talk a lot more about this implication. So there's just more literal inequality in these creatures themselves. And to some extent, although that's happening today, there'll be more ways to test the loyalty of these things. You can run one in a simulation, and maybe if it can't figure out if it's in a simulation, maybe it'll have better behave, because you might be testing to see whether it's loyal. You might be able to at least shallow mind read. Overall, these things are opaque, but there might be surface indications that are relatively obvious if you look at simple correlates of the structure that tells you whether it's scared, whether it's lying, etc., things like that. There is, of course, the long debate that people often had about whether these things are conscious, whether they are people, whether they are worthy of moral considerations. I'm not going to talk about that. I'm pretty sure people are going to continue to argue about that for a long time. But all it takes is a few people becoming these things, whether they're conscious or not, and all the implications I'm talking about will happen. I'm relatively insensitive to that conclusion. Of course, the ultimate overall moral evaluation of this world might depend crucially on whether you decide these things are conscious. But that's separate from most everything else I'm going to tell you. Humans would still exist, but eclipsed. Just like foragers are eclipsed today. You might realize that we didn't kill off all the foragers. There really are people still hunting in the woods and living in, on the move, etc. There just aren't very many of them, and we hardly care about them. We don't go hunt them down or anything, but as long as they're using something we don't care about, we're not that bothered by them. But humans would become eclipsed. Their wages would fall below the subsistence level if they're competing with these robots, unless there's direct demand. Somebody wants a real human waiter or something, and then you have to pay for that, etc. But if humans would be rich if they held any assets that were valuable in this new economy at the beginning of the transition. Owning real estate, stock in robot companies, patents, any share of anything, because if the economy is doubling every 2 weeks, investments are doubling every 2 weeks. And that doesn't take very long for you to have a really rich nest egg if you can double your investments every 2 weeks. So even if you're dirt poor just to start, you just need to save a little bit, get past that hump, and then you're rich. But you're rich, but your wealth can't, it's rich by today's standard, but you can't afford a Park Avenue penthouse. You know, important real estate assets will just be bid way beyond your reach. You'll be in the periphery, but you can spend your money and watch and enjoy the show. The idea that there would be a grand war between humans and these robots makes for a nice story, but it seems unlikely, and it's certainly a bad idea. You know, you might want to think about why we today don't kill all retirees and take their stuff. Because, of course, they're not productive in the economy. They're retired, right? So why don't we just do that? But we're part of a social system and a legal system, et cetera, where doing that to them would sort of threaten the whole system. And we're shy about that, which is good. So you can think of humans as the retirees in the robot world, off to the side in their leisure worlds, and not bothering the rest too much. Another dramatic, of course, one of the main relationships between this emulation world and the humans is that every emulation is a copy of a human who lived in the human world and may still live in the human world. But it would be very selective. If it costs money to create these emulations, and profit-making organizations do that in order to get a return on it, they will be very selective in who they choose. They will choose the most productive humans. The humans that not only are really good at their jobs before, but seem to be flexible, able to move into this new world, able to be productive and learn new tasks, adapt to the various alienation, etc., and take and work with that. Also, as they'll probably tend to be those who don't mind being workaholics, and even losing their memories often. Now, the first movers may be, whoever we think is the best, but it could be some billionaires, pay for themselves to go be one of the first movers. Whether they're the most productive is not as clear. What is more clear is there's not that much point in taking kids here. Kids are a luxury. You might as well emulate an adult brain ready to work, ready to be trained, than a child that needs another 20 years to grow up to be ready to do something. So, and then there's the issue of, since in our world the very peak of productivity in most professions is dominated by men, whether there'd be more men emulations than women emulations in this world. There's also the idea that if we have just a few of the very best, and we have trillions of copies of them in this new world, it could be that there are so few that we move back to the familiar human world where everybody knew everybody. Because in fact, for our forager ancestors, they basically had known everybody for all their lives they ever meet. There's only a few hundred people they ever meet, and they know them all very well. Personally, they've gossiped about them all. They just know their personality. It's an alien world from what we're familiar with, but it could go back to here. There's 300 or so people who are copied trillions of times. That's most of everybody. And you meet George, you know George. You don't know this George, what he's been up to lately, but you know George. And that's nice. And those are the one names that are all comfortable. And then there's the 7 billion other people out there who are two names. You don't know them all, and you don't trust them because you don't know them. But, these guys you all know. You don't like them, but you know them. Small world could return in that way. Let's talk. I'm going to sort of go through somewhat randomly a variety of sort of things to tell you about this world. I'm going to start off with things that I can show in pictures. So here, this is a time axis here, and on this axis we're thinking about splitting off to make copies, and we're thinking about the varieties of lives people could have when it's possible to make copies. This is your life. Start, end, that's it, no copies. This is the life of a person who's a lot like you, except on a busy day on the job, they can split off copies for an hour or two to do some tasks. And when the copies split off and say, okay, I'm heading to the store to get this stuff, back in an hour, and I know that in the hour I come back and get you the stuff, and that's the end of me. But I agreed to that an hour ago. That was the plan. It made perfect sense to me then. It makes sense to me now. It's not a problem. It's just an hour. Okay? So it could make sense to split off all these little work copies that help you do various tasks for short periods, because for a short period they won't really feel very different from you. They'll identify closely to you, and it won't really matter. There won't be a problem if they end in another hour. This is a more abstract lifespan of somebody where copies are made, and then opportunistically, locally, without hard to predict, some copies end and some continue depending on who wants, who's how valuable, which jobs are in demand, which skills happen to be useful, etc. And sometimes they're growing, sometimes they're shrinking, and that's just a complicated random tree. This might be someone who is writing software. So what you do in writing software is you say, okay, my system is going to have these 3 modules. Okay, it's 3 copies. And now we each work on our 3 modules, and now I need 4 subroutines, split into 4 people, make the 4 subroutines. Then one of us says, check, 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 gone, 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 gone. 3 people come back, okay, 3 modules, check them, work together, okay, right, got it, 2 gone, 1 guy left, wrote the whole software. And he knew what he was doing, he knew the plan all along, because it was him who made the plan. That's another style of work that's possible here, recursive structure of tasks. This variety of life, you can imagine this is a plumber, say. A short-term tasks, and this person wakes up in the morning, ready to go, and splits into 1,000 copies or 1,000,000 copies, all ready to do a plumbing task. When plumbing tasks come in, those get allocated. They do the plumbing tasks. When they're done, at the end of the plumbing task, they're off. And randomly, one of them, at the end of the 3-hour plumbing task window, one of them continues on, end of my work day. I can take the rest of the day off, have a nice long leisure. Maybe I take a whole week off. I run it actually really fast here, you see. And then from the point of view of customers, in 5 minutes, I'm ready again. A new set of plumbers ready to offer service. But subjectively, it took me a nice long leisurely day. I do 2 hours of work a day. 1,000 of me do. And then that's how we continue on day after day. So subjectively, it's a pretty nice life. Objectively, most of my time is working. Is that so bad? So these are some of the varieties of lives that become possible here in this emulation world in terms of what you do when. As I indicated, this is a work-dominated world in the sense that because we have a Malthusian situation where population expands quickly, wages fall to marginal value so that most workers are near the edge of just being able to afford to live because otherwise they wouldn't exist. So it's a work-dominated world, but in a work-dominated world still there's a wide variety of ways that you can live in that world depending on the kinds of tasks you do. Some kinds of tasks you don't have to last very long, you don't have to remember very much onto the next task. But other kinds of tasks you need to last longer because you have to accumulate and remember more about this particular task. Another thing to say here is these things can vary at a wide range of speeds. So we can run probably we can run these emulations 1,000,000 times faster than a human at only a linear cost, that it only costs 1,000,000 times more than one that runs at a human speed, because electronics is that much faster than human brain cells. But when these things run fast, if they actually have a physical body, it would be torturous to be in a body our size and run 1,000 times faster because it would just be molasses. It would hardly be moving. What works is to shrink down the body linearly with this process, the speed up. A body that's 1/10 the size of yours and run 10 times fast, a body would feel just about right. So there's also the issue of the faster you run, the closer the distance at which, if you were communicating at light speed to someone far away, you would start to notice the delay. So actually, for us, we can actually communicate at light speed with a larger sphere than the entire, the Earth, because that happens to be the size scale we're at. So light speed, a quarter second is a large compared to the circumference of the Earth. And we're at 1.7 meter, and our year isn't a year. And then this is a SEDT, subjective economic doubling time. Let's assume the economy is doubling every month here. Now we have another set of creatures who are 24 times faster than a human speed m. So for them, everybody within a radius of 1,000 kilometers they can talk to as if they were in the same place, but farther than that they notice delays. So that would be, say, the convenient city size to keep it within that so that everybody talks to each other without really caring where in the city they are. Their height would be 7 centimeters. For them, of course, it would take in our month, 2 weeks, they would experience a whole year. And subjectively, the world economy would double every 2 years for them. Then if we go another factor of 15 in speed, these are only 5 millimeters tall if we physically embodied them so they could match their body. They would experience a whole year in our day. And for them, the economy will double every 35 years. For them, the world economy is growing slower than it is for us. So this idea that the world economy is growing really fast depends on who we're talking about here. Whether they're talking about slow human speed things or faster other speed things. Because again, we could go 1,000,000 times faster. So we add another factor of 15 in speed. These things are 1/3 of a millimeter tall. And so here, these things that are a year and a day, they need a radius of 80 kilometers. Within that range, they can all talk to each other. That would be a plausible size of a city for them to not really care where you are in the city, to talk to everybody. And farther away, you notice the delay. And down here, they've got to be within a 5-kilometer range. So that's a pretty dense thing. But for a lot of the area we're talking about, you can fit the entire world economy of M's in a city this size anyway, because they're going to be really small in terms of the computing power, the size of the computer. So even ones that are this size, 5 millimeters tall, that means an ordinary skyscraper of ours can fit billions. So that's like a whole planet, basically, in one of our skyscrapers. So that's the scale of this world. So, their world is vast, but not because space is any bigger. It's because their spatial scales become much smaller on what they're caring about. So Earth becomes vast. Earth is a vast galaxy to them. Somebody running this fast because, it's a huge delay to go somewhere very far away. And strange things may be happening over there. Here's another interesting. So this is our familiar organizations. Up here I have a chart. See, basically you have 4 employees with 1 boss, and then there's 4 of these bosses, 4 of these line supervisors, line bosses I would call them, and they have a supervisor, and then 4 of them have a supervisor, and then 4 of these have a big boss. So this is like a 4 branching array per 5-level company. And this is how human organizations work. This whole tree structure exists so that all of these people can coordinate together. And it's very expensive to coordinate. And basically, these key channels are bottlenecks of information because these people only have limited time and attention. And so some things only can pop up so hard. And so it's hard to coordinate across organizations. So real human organizations really fail to coordinate a lot. And we pay a lot of attention to putting our very best people at the top and paying them a lot because this is really crucial to get right. So that's our familiar human organizations. With emulations, because we can make them run faster, what we can do is we can take these top 3 levels of bosses and have one guy do them all. So we've got just one boss who's the supervisor at this 3rd level for all the groups, and he's also meets with clients and outsiders. And he's just does all the boss jobs. And so he can coordinate all the boss jobs he's doing really well because he's the same guy. He has to pay a little transition cost. He's over here in marketing. Now he's in shipping. Now he's in design. Right? But he's running 20 times faster. He can just do 20 times as many things. He just does all those jobs. Now, of course, it means that when this guy wants to meet with his boss, he has to go move into special hardware that's running 20 times faster so they can have the meeting and they can have it at the same speed. But, that's doable. And so it means that bosses really are bigger creatures. I mean, they like to think of themselves that in our world, but really in our world, they're not that different from the rest of us. But here, they really are different. They are grand, larger creatures, larger than life, larger than our lives, because that's what works. So they could be big, and therefore they can be rich, and they can earn a large percentage of the firm, which can therefore help us overcome a lot of agency problems in firms, because they would actually own a big chunk of it. They were just one big guy who ran the whole thing. So that's, again, a kind of a thing that you might not realize can be done until you start to think about the possibility of changing speeds and things. So emulations are different from us. So first of all, the equilibrium of this world is it's very work-oriented. People need to be very competitive at being effective at work. Otherwise, they don't exist because the ones who are created are the ones who are really good. They're all healthy. There's no, at least physically healthy. They may have mental problems, but there's no really issue here of physical ill health. Presumably we select for the ones who need less sleep, who are very energetic. They're in virtual reality. They don't need to shop much. They don't need to brush their teeth. They don't need to sweep the bathroom. They don't need medicine. All of that stuff. So this is a budget of current sort of hours per week spent in various activities. And here's a candidate alternative hours per week for this new world, at least for the ones who spend a lot of time working, not like the plumber I told you about. He has a different sort of schedule. at least subjectively. But today, actually, the average adult spends 25 hours a week working. But it's quite feasible in many industries to have people work 80 hours a week. And they would. Because they would be at the peak of health and peak of productivity and selected for the ones who are best able to do that. There's no kids around or elders to take care of. They'll socialize, of course, because that's functional. It helps you make contacts, etc. There's a question of whether they will need rituals like cleaning and eating, because we seem to project a lot of psychology onto those things. And will we have some sort of religion or mind-altering, drug-like things? Rituals, who knows, but maybe there'd be something like that. So, go ahead.
Is that necessarily true? I mean,
which? Oops, sorry.
That like M's need less, attention to health and that kind of thing. I mean, isn't it possible that we might need to simulate an entire body to get human level cognition? In which case, we might still need less.
So it seems really clear that we have paraplegics whose body is really crap, and their minds work really well. So it's clear they don't need a well-functioning body for their minds to work. We also, it seems clear that humans are able to project onto various kinds of machines as if it was their body. So many of us feel our car as our body, or our lawnmower things. We learn to sort of feel as if they are ourselves. So our psychology is capable of running a wide range of bodies. We don't need to run this very specific body in order to run a body. We might want to run a body. It's psychologically nice to have a body, but it doesn't have to be exactly this body. And it certainly doesn't need to be exactly this body in terms of having all the exact illnesses and things going wrong. And you don't need corns on your toes and all that just to have a feel of a toe and something you can jump around on.
But if we still just need to simulate like spinal cord, there's quite a lot that could go wrong with the spinal cord.
But psychologically, from the spinal cord, the spinal cord has some computation in terms that it's really part of your brain. But in terms of the physical structural support your spinal cord gives, you can do that structural support in a wide range of ways in your body. Your mind won't know the difference. So we have a lot of freedom for how to redesign bodies to be convenient in this world, with the constraint that from the mind's point of view, it needs to be able to map onto it to control it and feel that it can access it and that it understands it and it can get the feelings it wants. But there's a wide range of possibilities for what the body could be. Certainly in virtual reality, it's really hard to imagine an emulation in virtual reality needs to emulate a spinal cord that has cancer in it because, otherwise it's not a real spinal cord, right? Your mind doesn't know the difference between a spinal cord that could have cancer and one that doesn't.
But we might need to understand cancer pretty well and just simulate bodies without it.
Who gets cancer rebooted?
Yeah.
Every copy could be bad. You just run it until it's bad, and then you restart it.
So the whole concept of whole brain emulation is this concept that the brain can be emulated without lots of details of the body, of the particular body we're in. Not that you don't need a body. That is, no doubt a lot of our psychology is tied around managing the body we have, and we would feel somewhat alienated and at lost and maybe go crazy without a body. But it doesn't have to be this body. We, in fact, have a wide range of bodies. Some of us get fat. Some of us lose a leg. Our minds still function under a wide range of body changes. So clearly we're robust to a wide range of bodies. So it seems really unlikely that somehow we need to have a body that can have cancer or we'll go crazy. That seems crazy. So one style of life could be that there's a team, and the team is copied together. So a team of people does a task together. Maybe it's a construction task, or maybe it's a marketing task. And somebody out there has a bid for saying, we need a new marketing department for this following product category. And various bids are made. People say, well, this team would work well, that team would work well. And these are sort of specified by who would be on the team, how much they get paid, what would be their contract, things like that. And then we could do various interesting institutions to choose which team gets selected, and then that whole team gets copied. That is, all the originals get a copy made for this new team. And now in this new team, before the team starts doing, you could have a training time, and you could actually have a training time where you go very fast. Maybe you'd make a bunch of copies of the team if you have a bunch of parallel tasks that need to be done. Maybe you'd pick the best of the training teams and to make a lot of copies of those. Then while the team is doing the job, they're working together, they work at the same speed, they can interact and socialize with each other. Maybe they have friends, maybe they're lovers inside the team. And then they get various metrics of getting more leisure time, maybe when they're doing better, or better reputation, or paid better. And then at some point the job ends, the task ends, and then the whole team ends. With some archive possibilities we'll talk about in a minute. But now there's less of a problem that your friend dies and you're still alive because you all die at the same time. And you're all born at the same time, so there's less of an issue of you competing for the friend. So if I'm a friend of somebody and then there's a copy of me, now there's a question of my friend, well, do we have to compete over our single friend now? But if you sort of make copies of friends together, then that's less of an issue. So one of the things people really get fixated here, because it is an issue, is this idea of death. Would emulations accept ending often? Because the economics of this says there are many short-term tasks, and it makes sense to create a short-term copy to do a short-term task and have it end. The question is how that matches with human psychology, because these are psychologically human. So at one end, I think, is most of us know that if we go to a party and there's something ingested where you won't remember the party the next morning, well, that's kind of a weird party. Maybe you don't want to go, maybe you do. But while you're at the party, you aren't like agonizing over, I'm going to die tonight, for God's sake, because nobody will ever remember what my thoughts I had tonight. That's not what people agonize about during the party. They might agonize about some other things, but not about that. So it seems clear that
I agonize about things like that.
Okay, well, most people don't, and it's possible to select people who won't agonize over that. But I think for most people, that's not so much a concern. Short-term, I'll call them spurs, short-term copies to do short-term casts. You identify with the original very closely. It's not so much an issue that it will end soon, because you understood that it would, and that was the deal in making the original short-term copy. For longer-term tasks, there's more of an issue. You'll want more to select the people who this won't be a problem for, because if it's a problem, then it's a problem. And that you may have to compromise on other characteristics of the workers to get people for whom that won't be a problem. And you may want an extra precaution of some outside control to evict them from their mind at the proper time without their permission, per se, if they're being troublesome. But then there's the issue of, during this task, they're working on a job, and they can anticipate the task will end soon. They can sort of see down the line that we're nearing the end of this task, and we're nearing the end of my usefulness here. What can keep this person working? So one thing obviously can be pride. Pride in their work, people saying nice things about them. They get every hour they get 10 minutes off. They get some leisure to enjoy, or every day they get to sleep, etc. There could be some chance that they'll come back for a new task, that they'll be selected for a new team. They could care about the reputation of their clan overall. They could be into sort of writing diaries and things that they hope somebody would read. There could also be what I call me now immortality, which means, so immortality, as you've usually heard it, is this idea that, well, there's this continuous path of me became the next me, became the next me, etc., until eventually there was this other me long later who could be really different than me now. But that's supposedly immortality. Now you could say from the me now point of view, that's not immortality, because that's not me. It was me, and eventually it became somebody else. Me now or immortality is me now is immortal. Well, what's that mean? The person I am, who doesn't change very much, I become immortal. Well, that's a different concept of immortality. Me now or immortality is somewhat hard to achieve, but one way of achieving it would be to create an archived copy of me now, who is brought back for short events at various times in the future, perhaps with declining frequency, such that the integrated total experience might be only a day, but maybe it goes through thousands of years. And so me now lasts and gets to watch the world faster and faster stuff happening, but me now is immortal. That's actually more feasible for these things, because that's actually cheaper, because you're not running them that much, assuming that the memory storage for these things is relatively cheap. So me now immortality could be feasible, and there could also be, and of course, if you have lots of copies, they could be compressed for that memory cost. So I mentioned some of this already. There's a variety of issues with your friends and family. Not everything you do is work, so how do we manage all this? One issue, as I mentioned, at the moment, the top of most professions is dominated by men, but most men seem to want women. So but then the women need jobs, but then somebody has to pay for them, and if they're not as good, what happens? And of course, sex is something we all still want, but this is not actually needed in this world anymore. Sex is not the basis of reproduction. We are sad when our friends end. We often get ideas via distant networks of people who talk about things, but we have this issue of competing with copies for friends and associates. We have the fact that when we have unpredictable friend changes, that can change our mood and change our productivity. It can be awkward to meet other copies of ourselves. Maybe we'd rather segregate that. We might still have paternal feelings, and what do we do with those? So some of these solutions, well, we might have more homosexuality and more men. We might have men sharing women. That's psychologically feasible. There have been societies where that's happened. It certainly seems like sex will move more toward being less of a morality issue and more of fun, because there is really less at stake here for sex. It's a diversion, really. It's if friends are parts of teams that begin and end together, a lot of these problems are mitigated. But then that means that you can't, friends that you have that are outside of these teams, you get more information from them. You can get more, innovation paths through that. But you have more risks now that they will unpredictably disrupt your mood. So if we have a set of team that works really well together, we make 1,000 copies of that. And the more we can control that environment, the more we can believe that they will work really together in a new environment. So any new disturbance is a problem. So we'd like the friends to stay inside the team, because that means if the team worked before, it works later. So we might want to discourage, in cases where reliability is really important, we want to discourage friendships and relationships outside the team. So it's a variance reliability issue.
How's that different to now?
We just have so much variance in people's productivity that we just suck it up and accept it. We've never had the option to have this sort of reliability in people's performance, so we just haven't done it. But once the option's there, it'll be tempting. It's tempting to have a very reliable worker because he has a very reliable friendship, lover, etc. Copy that all together, and then they can keep on being reliable. Take him away from that, introduce new things, who knows what happens. You also might have a social thing of just avoiding meeting your own copies. You sort of spread them around in these different worlds, so you rarely run into yourself, basically, except for these spurs who don't socialize with anybody. So a spur is, I split a copy off myself for an hour, he doesn't meet anybody but me, or if he does, nobody ever sees him and me at the same time. And so it's not like a problem. So there's a bunch of issues here with speed. As I said, we could run the speeds up to 1,000,000 times faster and probably get near linear cost. So that gives us a lot of options about how fast to run these things. There'll be probably a roughly constant memory cost to just store the memory. Hopefully that's small, but if it's large, it'll be an issue, more of an issue. So running fast seems to be per work done. It doesn't cost you any more to have the work done in a half a second than it has to be done in a day, because you can just run it faster and it's a linear speed up in the cost per second, right? Except fast people need to run on premium spots so they can talk to other people, right? If you need a bunch of people to talk to each other and they run fast, then they have to be close enough to each other to talk, and that means they have to sit on premium spots. And so it gets expensive where they sit, but not so much just the raw hardware to have them run. So it depends on if they need to be next to a lot of other fashionable, big shot people, then that's expensive. If they can be in a group all by themselves off to the side, well, that's not less of an issue. So just like our fast boss doesn't have to be expensive if he doesn't talk to other fast bosses in fast boss mode. He just runs his company, etc. So speeds will vary a lot by task. So if you're running some system, physical system, there'll be an optimal speed for the physical human who's running it to run at, and those speeds will vary widely across a wide range of tasks. That's somewhat at odds with the fact that when people socialize and interact, they'll want to be running at the same speed. So we have an issue of what speeds do we have people run at if for the task there's different speeds, but socializing they need the same speed. There's also the nice feature that if you've got like a plumber, he can have short leisure be just a really small fraction of time. His downtime can be really small if he runs his leisure really fast. So like I said before, he worked for 2 hours of plumber, then he takes 5 minutes to have a day's worth of leisure, and then he's back ready to do 2 hours worth of plumbing again. So that's, and then we have this fast bosses who can coordinate, and then there are some kinds of tasks where there's just a competition to run as fast as possible. So if you're competing with another software firm to develop a software product, you might as well just run as fast as you can if you're just talking internally, because you're trying to get out the door faster. So you're going to be pushing up to the point where you're going past, you're in the nonlinear cost regime. It's costing you more to run faster. And then the question is how far you go in that regime. But then you're running really fast. millions of times faster than humans. So those things will basically happen just like that compared to all the other stuff that happens. Once people realize we're in a competition for who can do this fastest, it just happens. Boom. So in general, leisure speeds should be faster than work speeds. When people of different speeds meet, the slow one would speed up temporarily and switch over to faster hardware so they could interact. The social speeds should clump. The speeds at which people are social should be a few standard speeds and not millions of them. One of the clump of social speeds would be the fastest possible, at least the fastest linear possible, which would then split spatially because the time delays. And a lot of these features of speeds look a lot like features of social classes. So a social class is a group of people who interact together, where it's hard for other people to get in. The faster ones, they're more bosses, they're richer, they're more valuable, they're in more elite spaces that you pay more for. All of the marks of social class. So here you actually do have discrete, distinguished social classes of the sort that people don't like. But there you are. Say again?
They live longer, subjectively.
Right, yes.
They could live millions of times.
Right, exactly. They could be very old. So the faster classes would be subjectively far older. And for them, the world would be an ancient world that hardly changes. They are pharaohs because their world is hardly changing at all. They are gods and pharaohs in that sense. In our world, one of the limitations on city size is the fact that there is travel congestion. As you may have noticed in London, around here or something, one of the limits on how far away from London you can live and still work there is that it's expensive time-wise to travel into the center. For the creatures who interact via virtual reality, where they just keep their brains in one spot and then they send signals so that they can have the impression that they are interacting in the same space with the other one, that interaction bandwidth can be relatively mild. So it means cities can be really huge without much congestion limitations. So that sort of bandwidth to communicate is not really much of a congestion limitation. So that means cities would just be huge, because there really are huge gains from people being together in the same city. The limitation on city side would be based on the speed and then the delay and how much of a delay was tolerable when you were interacting. Although when you start to actually try to move brains around, well, that requires a much harder bandwidth. And so that can cause more of a congestion stuff. So you might have most of the world economy being in a small number of dense city states, maybe in Scandinavia, like I showed you. This world is a vast economy, much larger than ours, but it might take a small spot on the Earth. And most of the rest of the Earth might be much like it looks today. Because they're all concentrated near each other, doing an immense, valuable, concentrated, dense activity, presumably throwing off enormous amounts of heat, sucking in enormous amounts of water, pumping out enormous amounts of boiling water, destroying the ecosystems nearby, no doubt. But still, the rest of the planet needn't be very different. Because a huge economy isn't necessarily a spatially large economy. Is that a hand?
But you could just do that over the entire Earth.
But it takes time. So eventually that would happen. Certainly eventually Earth will be occupied. And so remember one of my early method comments, I'm focused on the next era. And there will be eras after that, and they may come in a short clock time. That is, it might be the world economy doubling every 2 weeks. In a year it's doubled 25 times, right? 26 times. So by then, things could be huge. But still, subjectively to these things that are running 1,000 times faster than we are, a lot has been happening in this era. It's been a long subjective era, and so I'm interested in describing that long subjective era, because it'll just be harder to describe the next era until we get this one right. Just like it would be really hard to imagine the M era if you had known what industry was like. If you were just farmers and you knew that M's would be possible later, and you were trying to describe the M era without ever having thought through what industry was like, you would be somewhat at a loss. So I'm saying, if you want to think about the next era after this, get the next era right first. Or at least take a first shot at that. There'll be these huge city-states, really, a few of them, perhaps. And there'll be this huge premium on fast development. So the question is, where would these new cities be? So one obvious place is to put them right next to the big, dense human cities, because that's where the initial ones could get the most customers, say New York City, Shanghai, etc. But those cities have a lot of rules about what you're allowed to do. And the first M skyscrapers may be really disruptive to the local city folk, and they maybe take them a long time to get various zoning permits, etc. to do stuff. So maybe, in fact, most likely things will happen wherever they're allowed to change fast, where they're allowed to sort of set aside the usual rules and just say, fine, we're going to do stuff different because this has to happen fast. And that could be up in the mountains of Scandinavia, who knows where exactly. But then it might be well with where the new data centers are now, where people are locating big computing facilities, often in places like Scandinavia where there's a lot of cooling, natural air cooling, a lot of water nearby for water cooling, near big city centers but not right at them. And then because they're willing to change a lot of stuff here, they have to in order to make all these new things happen. They have a whole new sort of ways to do plumbing, ways to do transportation, everything else. Maybe they'll also be willing to try new kinds of institutions. We economists have been talking about all sorts of institutions that seem like they would make sense to us, but everybody goes, we're not doing anything like that. We don't see why we should change. It looks like a lot of trouble. We like what we got. And so economists go, yeah, you're probably right. But when stuff is changing big time, and you're throwing out all the old ways anyway, then we can stick in and say, as long as you're making some changes, I got some new mods here, why don't you try my new forms of government, etc. So this is, if you have some grand radical ideas for change, this is a best shot of getting somebody to try them, because it's a point in time where people are making big changes anyway. The same way in any sort of product or software, if you've got a very stable product, you want to add a mod, they say, no, that conflicts with our other parts of the product. You say, but we've got this new revision of the product, and in the new revision, we're allowed to do a lot more changes. And this is a new big revision. Civilization 3.0, something like that. Also, if you are running a government and you're not a democracy and you want to keep an iron grip on everybody, not only can you read people's minds, at least on the surface, and put them in SIM audits to check whether they're loyal, but you can have all the people at the top levels of the government not only be you when you're running fast, but when that doesn't work, have them all be copies of you. And if they're not as productive of their task, they're loyal. So there. So autarky becomes more feasible, as you can see. It's more possible to have very powerful creatures who have control over a lot more than powerful creatures in our world. And that brings us to the subject of inequality. Up in the upper right-hand here corner, we have a distribution chart. The idea is that these are how big things could be, and this is how often they show up. And these are power laws that relate these factors, and there's basically three kinds of power laws. There's power laws where most of the distribution is in small things, so this is an alpha greater than 1. There's a lot of them here, and they're small. There are distributions where most of the weight is in big things, a few big things, and this is where the alpha of the power law is less than 1. And then there are things right on the border where the stuff is distributed across all possible scales roughly equally. And that's an alpha of 1. So let's review inequality today. In firms today, alpha is actually about 1. It used to be greater than 1. It used to be most firms were small, but now firms are actually spread equally across the entire feasible scale of firm sizes. That's also true of cities and nations. They also happen to be spread equally across all possible sizes of such things. And they also used to be, the cities and nations, of course, used to be much smaller, typically. Families are mostly small. Alpha equal to 1. Wealth is also, there's a few really rich people, but wealth is still mostly among people who are poor, hold most of the wealth. Relatively poor. So in our world, the richest person in the world, Bill Gates, holds 0.02% of the wealth, which is about 50 billion. And about 40% of the world's wealth is in the top 1% of people, who are about 70 million of them. And each of them have about $500,000, which is about 20 times the average in the world. Here is my 2046 reference scenario. Again, I said anytime in the next century or so. But I did a model. So here in this world, there's a population of roughly 100 trillion M's. Firms are, again, probably roughly distributed across all possible sizes. Within each product category, though, they tend to be concentrated. There are just usually a few firms who produce any one product. The distribution becomes because there are so many different products. City-states, these city-states, I expect, there'll be a small number of them, and most everybody will be in that. Families, again, I expect more of this small number of one-name people. Most copies are of a few few hundred best people. So each of those families has roughly 500 billion copies. Income is now more unequally distributed because these things can live a long time. Wealth in our world, it tends to be more equally distributed because you get rich and then you die. And then your children waste it all. And then we're back to square one. Whereas these ones can keep staying and getting rich and living indefinitely. And that makes a difference. So that makes a difference in the power laws. We take this, now the power law of income becomes more like the power law of firms or cities are today, spread across all possible scales. And then we do the numbers there, and now we find that in this world, the richest person holds 3% of the wealth instead of 0.02%, factor of 100 increase, and he's worth $150 trillion income a year. The half of the wealth in the world is in the top 10 millionth, who are also coincidentally around 10 million of them, and they each have an income of about $1 million a year, which is about 200,000 times the average of $4 a year, because M's can be really cheap here. So you can see the actual median wealth is about the same and has about the same number of people above the median wealth, even though these are vastly different economies. Law and regulation. So certainly one of the things that people often think about in this world is when you make a copy, who owns it? Or what do they own about themselves? So one scenario is you make a copy and it's a gift. The copy, like your children today when they grow up, they go away, you gave them the gift of their training, and you don't get any returns on that unless they are nice to you in return. Or it could be a loan, right? You endow a new copy, it's got its new hardware, it's got its new job, and it has a loan that it has to repay in order to stay. If it can't repay its loan, it's evicted from its borrowed hardware, and that's the end. But it's still autonomous, it just has a loan to repay. Or it could even be stock, where some of the rest of us own a share in this person's income. We paid a share of the cost to endow it, but now we have some voting rights over what it does, perhaps. Or it could just be a slave, complete only by whoever created it. These are all a wide range of possibilities, but actually the overall economic consequences don't actually depend much on that. It might feel very different what that world looks like, thinking of those rules, but the rest of it don't depend that much. You could try to sort of prevent there being so many really poor creatures by having a high minimum wage, or a rule that you can't evict creatures, or a rule that all things have to be gifts. But by doing those rules, you'll create the risk that somebody will secretly have a lot of slaves that are hard for you to see, because mechanically that might be easy. So the question is how well you could enforce these rules against the temptation to evade these laws by black market slaves, basically. One interesting approach would be technically to have the ancestors own all their descendants directly, and then this me now immortality means they can be called back to adjudicate disputes. Clans will need to regulate each other in the sense that clans will depend on each other for their reputation. They'll have to be held responsible. If I make a spur for an hour and it goes and commits a crime, I say, that was a spur, that wasn't me. The law, there's no way the law is going to let you get away with that. You made the spur, it went and did this in the last hour, you're responsible. So copies will be held co-responsible within some scope. It's not clear what that scope is, but certainly within some scope, copies will be held co-responsible. For that means they'll need to have some co-control over you as well. At some level, they'll have some legal regulation their behavior. Also with training, if I train one copy and then I make 1,000 copies, and those 1,000 copies were each able to compete down the wage, then they would compete down the wage of the marginal cost, which wouldn't recoup the training, et cetera. So we need a way to keep the wage they can charge above some minimum to recoup our training costs. So we need some controls there too. Finally, mind theft would be an obsession. It might even be sort of the core moral principle in this world, which is that people would be both psychologically terrified of, morally outraged by, and economically threatened by the possibility that somebody could steal a copy of them and then distribute it and sell it a lot, because that would undermine their whole revenue model. So there are a variety of approaches to that. One of them, interestingly, though, is that some people presumably will just go open source. Some people will just say, look, anybody can copy me if you've got a job. You wake me up, you got a job for me, I'll do the job. If I don't like it, I'll say, you can kill me. But other than that, I'm available. So you got to be reasonable, but here's my constraints, and here I am, I'm open source. Anybody can copy me, and then when people copy me, have you do tasks, you leave that copy around. That might be a better trained copy somebody else will want for another task, etc. Open source people. Another sort of opposite variation is a bunch of people could make a whole city with just them. And they, close the curtain, and we send product out, but you can't come inside. You can't see what we're doing. We don't trust anybody in here. Just us. No siree. Then there might be sort of places more like the United States is trying to become, or maybe Britain is trying to become, high monitoring. Everything will be watched. We will be careful to check for stolen copies all the time. And as long as we're doing that, we might as well check for IP usage and whether everybody's paying for the right patents and copyrights and everything else. And we'll just have a high monitoring world where you can be pretty sure stuff isn't being illicitly stolen, although it might be officially stolen in lots of other ways. Or you might have things breaking into castles. Each clan might have its own fortress in a city. We say, okay, we'll go out of our fortress to do jobs as virtual reality workers by interacting virtual reality, but the brain copy stays in the fortress. And you therefore do not steal copies because they never leave. Which works well for security. It doesn't work so well for a firm having a bunch of workers all being close and being able to interact quickly and do things flexibly. Where there's more trust, maybe they would send a copy to a firm, and a firm becomes a fortress, and the copies never leave the firm fortress or something like that. All right, so last slide. And maybe there'll be a few questions or comments. So your descendants will be different from you, just like you are different from your ancestors. Farmers and foragers might not be that thrilled with who you are. They'll love some things about you. They'll hate other things. Overall, will they love you? Would they accept you? I don't know. Will you accept your descendants? I don't know. Should you? I don't know that either. But I do know that if you're going to disown your descendants and say they're terrible creatures who should never exist and we should prevent them all from existing, you should know a lot about them before you do that. And so this is my effort to try to tell you what these descendants are like, at least in this reference scenario, if whole brain emulation is the thing that happens. And then you can, seeing them in detail, their lives from their point of view, what they love, what they hate, what they do, what that matters to them. If you still want to disown them, okay. My technique for creating this scenario is to just try to combine standard brain research with standard economics, not being creative, not being original, not coming up with brand new theories, not even using iffy, state-of-the-art, edgy theories, just very basic economics. Everything I've done is really basic, really simple economics, not at all controversial. What's controversial is the assumptions I made that there are these M's and they have these technical features, which I'm taking from the brain researchers. So, and we can also use an analysis like this if we think the world is bad in some ways to nudge it a little. I'm skeptical you can change a world that much if it's, if farmers had anticipated industry, how much differently could they have made the world of industry? Not that much, I don't think, but they could have made it a little differently in parts, and that could be worth doing. There's a lot at stake here. All right, comments, questions?
It looks